Okay, we are live, Nancy. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so very much. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Northwest Indiana Green Drinks presentation. And Katie and I are going to take care of some things that need to be taken care of before we actually hand the session over to Erin Argyilan. And I also want to say this is our 11th year, and we're about halfway through it. And just really thank you, all of you, from the bottom of our hearts, that you are the ones who make this series of presentations possible. And by the number of people we have joining us this evening, I think we have a very popular topic tonight. I want to thank our sponsors, of course, Northwest Indiana Green Drinks, Save the Dunes. Katie Hopgood and Harshini are here as staff persons from Save the Dunes this evening. 219 Green Connect. I haven't seen Kathy Sybil, but I know that she's been very overwhelmed with the number of projects she has on her plate right now. And also the Michigan City Sustainability Commission. These are our ongoing sponsors that make this whole series possible. So thank you to all of them. Also, we have special hosts this evening, 95.1 AM WIMS, which is also 1420 FM. Indiana University Northwest, I have to give a shout out to them since that is the university that Dr. Argyilan teaches at. And also I want to specifically point out the geosciences department there. And I'm going to give a little plug. People that graduate with degrees in geoscience are some of the people that have guaranteed jobs, and there's actually a shortage of people in this particular field. So thank you so much that Indiana University continues to provide a specialization and also a degree in this particular area. So that's about that as far as my introduction. Oh, I'm going to say right away that July is the month we take our summer break. So don't be looking for us the first Thursday in July, because we will not be here. We want you to go out, enjoy the outdoors, get out in our dunes, enjoy Lake Michigan. I know for a number of us, it's a time that visitors come to see us. So really just enjoy the people in your lives, whether that be your family and or your friends. So Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you for those housekeeping items that you so skillfully go over each month for us. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Very happy to have you joining us either here on Zoom or watching on the Save the Dunes Facebook page. So just so you know, this presentation is being recorded. So if you really enjoy it and you want to share it with your family, friends, and your network, we would encourage you to do so. The recording will live on Save the Dunes Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. And those links are shared out in our monthly e-newsletter. So if you're not signed up, I would encourage you to do so. You can just head to our website, which is savedunes.org, to get yourself signed up. And then you will always have those links. Everyone who is on Zoom is muted just to cut out on background noise. If we do have time at the end, we'll allow you to unmute yourself to ask questions, but I anticipate that we're going to have a lot to talk about today. So I would really encourage you to drop your questions into the chat or the comment section just as they come up for you, and then we'll get through as many as we can at the end. I think that is everything. So Nancy, I'll go back to you.
Okay, thank you so very much. Dr. Erin Argyilan really doesn't need an introduction to this group, I'm sure. She's one of our most popular presenters, actually. This is the third time that she's presented to Northwest Indiana Green Drinks. The first time was actually on this particular topic of the dunes holes, also known as dune decomposition chimneys. And I have to let everybody know Erin is one of the few geologists probably that has been able to name a unique feature in our geology. So she's very humble about this, but this really is a big deal. So I want all of you to know that. And Erin, if there's anything else that you want our our participants to know about you this evening, will you please let them know that? Okay?
Okay.
It's all yours.
All right. Let's see. Thank you very much. Let's go through the hardest part, which is the sharing the presentation first. All right. Oh. See? Never a smooth start. Here we go. How does that look? Okay.
That looks really good.
All right, great. So thank you all for having me. I am really excited to be here. Time has been passing since this initial accident happened, and we're coming up, as Nancy said, on the 10-year anniversary, and it seemed like an important time to share kind of what we talk about at scientific conferences, but may or may not get out to all the public. So I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. So today I'll be talking about Mount Baldy's, the Dune holes 10 years later, and the science behind it, specifically focusing on the science. And before I even get started, I want to say, well, Nancy gives me so much credit, and I appreciate that. This is definitely ongoing collaborative work. And two of the biggest partners in this are the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. And I've listed some important people below there. Todd Thompson and I have been working together for, oh man, it's been over 20 years now, 25 years. And he's actually the geologist. He started his PhD here and did most of the geology of our region. So a lot of the maps and information and drawings that you see out there are from Todd, and we continue to work together. So I'll say he was the first person I called when this happened on Mount Baldy. And then the other people have helped with producing research products ever since. And then of course the National Park Service, they're not required to let me keep digging around up there, working up there, but they understood my obsession, and they're amazing partners, and specifically the whole resource management team. But I want to recognize Charlie Morris and Augustin Perez Maldonado, and of course Superintendent Labovitz, who was not the superintendent at the time, I should say that. And then also we call him Johnny K, who has been doing most of the ecological restoration up there as well. And then also the interpreters. They're doing a great job of keeping this story going and helping people understand why Mount Baldy has been closed and the science behind it. And they're constantly striving to do better and to keep this in the mind's eye and keep education out there. So let's get started. First of all, we're coming up on the anniversary, but this was the main headline that in July of 2013, actually it was July 13th, that there was this miraculous rescue of Nathan Wosner, who had become trapped in a void on Mount Baldy. And the rescue was truly a miracle. More than 3 hours. And this recently, there was a wonderful story on WGN. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you do, and we can share out the link for it. But it was showing that Nathan is not only doing fine, but he is thriving, which was really wonderful for me to see. I loved that that story came out. So the actual incident, he was buried for more than 3 hours. He was rescued using heavy equipment by scraping away inch by inch at the surface. There are no lasting health impacts that have been reported. And in the story, they really emphasize that this is a family of faith, and they were able to find peace with the incident and used it as an example of the grace of God. And the cause, of course, everyone kind of knows this now, and we say it as just something simple and basic that, oh yeah, the hole was caused by a decaying tree. But there's so much more to the story. And that's where I want to kind of take you guys today. So the rescue itself was a miracle, and it was miraculous, but the first responders never, ever gave up. But there were also so many things that I saw by being there that day that also came together to make this possible and to make understanding why this happened possible. First of all, there was a geologist, myself, present on Mount Baldy when the accident actually happened. And we saw the family digging and went up to find out what had happened. Weirdly enough, that geologist, me, was also pregnant. And that accident, maybe because it was a child, I'm not sure, but it just grabbed a hold of me and it wouldn't let go as far as needing to understand what actually happened there. The other thing that was so important there is that it also toppled what I thought I knew about dunes. So while I might think that I know a lot about geology and they give me a lot of credit, if you ever have to stand there and realize how much you don't know, it's a pretty humbling experience. Another thing that we rarely talk about is the fact that there were record low lake levels. So we talked about the fact that we moved heavy equipment down the shoreline to rescue Nathan, but that wouldn't have even been possible today. And so we were at record low lake levels in 2013, and there's actually space on the beach to drive the heavy equipment from the NIPSCO area down to Mount Baldy. And again, it just blows my mind that on most normal years, this wouldn't have even been possible. Also, the time of day. This is at the end of our workday. We were actually really, really excited because we had finally gotten our one full day of data. And so just imagine that the NIPSCO plant probably would have been shutting down. There were not many people present at the time. And so the fact that we were able to get people to just pour into Mount Baldy for this rescue was really also kind of miraculous as well. The relentless first responders, and that doesn't even go into talking about the people who participated at the hospitals and after the accident. We had a superintendent that approved the use of heavy equipment despite all the challenges that they were facing. And then this is a weird one, but we had a ranger with us, and it was a student that I was working with that was actually a literature major. And I'm going to tell you why that's important, actually. After the incident, she was standing there and she said, "This sounds so familiar." And in the days and weeks afterwards, she remembered a book by Ken Kesey, Sometimes a Great Notion, also the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But in this book, it's staged actually in Florence, Oregon, where a similar type of dune movement is happening, where trees are buried. And we went into the book and we found this information here, these quotes, where I'll let you read them for a second. Basically, the young boy falls into a hole. He's cold and he's scared. They can't find him. And it turns out that the characters say that he fell into a devil's stovepipe. And what that was when the dunes moved around trees, buried them, and the trees eventually rotted out, leaving the hollows. And that was exactly what he fell into. Now, we scoured the scientific literature. There was nothing on dune holes there at all. The things that we did find, we couldn't actually find great science to back up the idea, but we were able to see that this was going to be a problem that needed to be solved in an interdisciplinary way. And so, again, there are many ways of knowing the world. And Nathan's family, as I said, is a family of faith, and they were able to find peace in their sense of faith. I tend to know the world through science. And so I felt extremely rattled, and it sent me on a long journey of trying to figure out the science behind this. And of course, the science is going to be what helps the National Park Service try to make a management decision and to also assess risk. So what I want to do today is, of course, because I'm a teacher at heart, I'm going to take you through a little bit of a lesson. We're going to start with a brief geologic background of ancestral Lake Michigan in Northwest Indiana and what we call the Tolleson Beach. I'm going to give you just a little bit, very basic, Dune Dynamics 101. We'll talk about humans as the dominant force of environmental change. And then we'll talk about the progress of science on Mount Baldy. All right, so we're going to start way back. But of course, we all know that the Lake Michigan that we see today is not the same Lake Michigan that has been there through time. This area has been influenced by the Laurentide ice sheet, and that the Great Lakes Basin itself has been changing in size and in shape and in water levels in response to changes in the presence, movement, or absence of glacial ice. So when that ice retreats, these pictures show us through time, starting about 14,000 years ago and moving up more towards present. But of course, the oldest times, around 13,600 years ago, we had glacial ice that was sitting in the north, blocked off most of Lake Michigan and all the other Great Lakes, especially the upper Great Lakes. So these are some major high and low phases through time, but as that ice retreats, it changes the outlets, the connecting outlets between basins. It changes the way water moves through the basins, and again, the water level responds. So sometimes we forget that our little modern Lake Michigan that we see down here in the bottom right, has really only been this way for about the last 1,200 to 1,400 years. Before that, Lake Superior, Huron, and Michigan were all one connected hydrologic lake. And then Lake Superior only isostatically rebounded and separated from Lake Michigan Huron about 1,200 years ago. So most of what we're going to be talking about is a lake that's existed since the high water levels of the Nipissing about 4,500 years ago, and then of course up to present. Now, since those high waters of the Nipissing, our lake has been set up so that we get longshore drift, which is sands that are carried in the nearshore zone, and they're carried down the east and the west sides of Lake Michigan, and they just happen to be transported down to the southern shore of Lake Michigan, which is our Indiana coast. So just think about, for the last at least 45,000 years, much longer throughout this whole time, we've been pumping sand into our system, and the lake has been responding and the land has been building. So we've progressively been building Northwest Indiana by moving the shoreline northward because of all this excess sediment. And again, this is an overly simplified version of that. So maybe you'll invite me back for a more complicated talk about just the lake dynamics. But what we see is that Northwest Indiana ends up being part of what we call the Calumet-Lacustrine Plain Physiographic Region. So over time, this sediment has pumped down into Lake Michigan as longshore drift. It's accumulated down here at the bottom, and it results in a really complex geology. When you change the geology, you change the hydrology, and then the ecology is built on top of all of that. And I like to add this map from Shirley Hines Land Trust that shows their conservation areas and different ecological units, because it's superimposed right now on a digital elevation model of the region. And so I love to just kind of the message that they're getting out there between the relationship between geology, hydrology, and ecology. And so we're of course going to be focusing on this really special region up here, the yellow coastal dune region. Of course, this blue region is also coastal dunes, but a special type again, dune and swale. And so this history, geologic history, is part of the reason why we have this really complex ecology all stacked in one place. And it's always worth mentioning that the Indiana Dunes is the 5th most biodiverse national park in the country. Throughout this talk, I also want to introduce you to some resources that you can go back to on your own, because I found them extremely useful. We've even contributed information from our research to some of these reports. And one of the most important ones is this geologic resources inventory for the Indiana Dunes National Park. So I put the link here. You can download it yourself online, but I'm going to be using a lot of the images from that report as well. And in that report, it tells us about geodiversity, and it'll give you a really nice introduction to our region, talk about specific geologic features and processes, and even talk about geoconservation. You can also download the most up-to-date geologic map of Northwest Indiana. And you can see, you can't read all of these symbols, but I can just kind of relate to you that each of these colors means something slightly different. I'm going to show you a slightly simplified version of this in just a moment. But the purples and the greens are all glacial deposits. Okay, so the ice would have stopped here and built these glacial deposits in front. Everything that's in this orange and yellow and red is the coastal lake plain. So once the ice had retreated, sediment was being pumped down into the area, and it formed these complex geologic features. And of course, the hydrology and ecology evolved all around that. So here's a very simplified version of that same map. And one of the things that I love about Northwest Indiana that makes it so special is that you can actually, instead of digging down to go back in time, like most geologists do, you can actually walk from south to north to go from older in geologic time to more modern features. And that's again, because we've been pumping the sediment down, so the whole shoreline has been moving northward. So that nice orange feature you see here with the funky little fingers, this is actually what we call the Griffith Spit. And so this looks very much like what you might get on the East Atlantic coast or near the Gulf of Mexico today, where it's very shallow and sands are coming down and forming this nice distinct barrier beach. And then the fingers kind of fan out into shallow embayments behind. And that's our oldest major distinct shoreline. You see it in Griffith. And so sometimes it's really called the Glenwood Spit, but we often call it the Griffith Spit. And that's about 13,400, 13,600 years old. Then in front of that, if you've ever driven along Ridge Road, you probably notice that you're higher up than the surrounding landscape. That's another major coastal feature, and that's the Calumet Beach, and that's about 11,800 years old. And you can see how all of these creeks and Little Calumet River kind of develops around these features. Everything in green here is just kind of the swampy area that developed around these big barrier beaches. And then everything in yellow, this is slightly different. It's everything that developed as part of coastal processes during the past approximately 6,500 years. So that can be kind of confusing, but this is what we refer to when we talk about the Toleston Beach. It's going to include things like beach ridges and dunes and a variety of landscape features. But basically, it's when we were at a high water level of the Nipissing phase. Then the water level basically fell, exposed a bunch of sand that started moving around in the system, and we started doing a lot of really active landscape building. And Mount Baldy is part of all of the dunes. Basically, everything that we think of as the Indiana Dunes falls within this Toleston Beach. Oops. All right, so let me go back for a second. In this red box, this is where we are. Right left of Michigan City here is where we enter into Mount Baldy. So this whole study area is what you're going to see on the next picture. We talk about kind of how that landscape developed. It gives us some background for what we're going to see later underneath Mount Baldy when we started doing things like ground penetrating radar. So these are diagrams that were generated by Todd Thompson, again, our state geologist, and are included in that geological resources inventory. But here you can see that starting at about 6,500 years ago, that was our Nipissing phase. Water levels were climbing, and we developed this crazy little barrier beach in front of what is now Great Marsh. So this blue area is going to turn into Great Marsh. Underneath at the bottom, you can see because the water was kind of trapped and still there, it became a lagoon. And so that gray means that it's a clay. And so over time, we reached the Nipissing high water level and then started dropping. So we developed this really profound barrier beach in front of the Great Marsh, and then between the Great Marsh and Lake Michigan. And then water levels began to fall very, very rapidly. Up here in the upper right, this is the hydrograph that we've been putting together over the years. This is this high Nipissing phase about 4,500 years ago. And then you see this really rapid drop. And Todd likes to say that you might hear the water go whoosh if you were standing there. I'm not sure it would happen that fast, but you can see this really, really rapid fall. And whenever you drop water levels, that means you make a lot of sand available to start moving around. And so we started building a lot of dunes in this period that we call the post-Nipissing interlude from about 4,500 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. And we'll see those dunes later on. So this area that is lakeward of the Great Marsh really started building all of the dunes that we now think of as the Indiana Dunes. And by the time we get to about 3,500 years ago, we've separated out the Great Marsh. It's its own kind of distinct unit. The clay is still there underneath, and everything in the front is going to become the dunes and, of course, Mount Baldy. And I put this picture right here of Miller Beach, just so you could get an idea of what we mean by like a barrier beach that might trap water behind to form a lagoon. And if you've ever been to Mount Baldy and seen the clay that's there, a lot of people complain when they try to anchor their boats, they drop it into the clay that's under the water. That was formed as part of this back barrier lagoon. All right, so let's get into some dune dynamics. If you're from Michigan City like Nancy is, you're probably familiar with this map. It's an 1869 map of Michigan City, and it shows you the development, the earliest development of the Michigan City Harbor. But one of the things that's really helpful about this is that you see the style of dunes that we had in the area that is now Mount Baldy. So Mount Baldy would be just to the top here, which is west of the Michigan City Harbor. And so we had these big en echelon dunes, high relief, and they stacked right up adjacent to the water. And you see that on this side as well, too. So let's talk a little bit about dunes and what they are. So, oops, I got a little typo there, but dunes are landforms created by aeolian or wind transport of sand. They literally just move grain by grain and blow it along to form this pile of sand, but it has distinct properties. So let's take a look at the diagram here to the right. So you can see this nice distinct shape. Sand is going to blow up what we call the windward side, the prevailing winds. It'll just kind of saltate or bounce and blow up what we call the Stoss slope until it reaches the crest. The crest is going to be the highest elevation, and then it's going to cascade down that leeward slope. Dunes also have a critical angle of repose, anywhere from about 30 to 34 degrees. So if they get over steepened, they'll collapse. Or if you come along at the bottom here and you cut this off, sometimes you see people build a little retaining wall. You can come back and you'll see that retaining wall is just bending right back out again because the dune is trying to achieve that angle of repose again. And the sand always is going to win. Okay, so this individual is grain by grain. Now, when the dune form moves, it's not that it slides along. So somehow people still have this kind of weird misconception that when a dune moves, it's almost like a like a conveyor belt. It just kind of pushes along like a bulldozer maybe, but it's not. The dune form is actually moving, and that's why I like this drawing. It has kind of this time one where you have this original position of the dune, and then you notice that with continued migration and continued wind blowing, the entire dune form moves because you take sand from, let's just call this the lakeward side because that's what's happening at Mount Baldy. And you take it from the lakeward side and you blow it up to the crest and you cascade it down on that Stoss slope or the slip face. So again, it's the dune form that is migrating, but the dune itself will bury anything that's in its way. And you can see that again here on the bottom. We get these really nice, distinct slip faces. We're going to see those again in our ground penetrating radar too, which is really cool to see. But the main thing that you should take away from this is that we should never expect to see these open voids, right? So when I was standing at Mount Baldy and someone said there was a huge hole and a boy slipped into it and we can't see him anymore at the surface, my mind could not compute that, because there never should be an open void, because it's just grain of sand stacking on top of grain of sand. And so again, while people still say like, okay, we understand it was decaying trees, like, no, like this is really, really an unusual situation. So as part of our work, we've been looking a lot at what we call LiDAR. So LiDAR allows you to fly from a plane. The state flies it periodically. It's supposed to be every 3 years, but we haven't seen our most recent stuff. But it allows you to strip off everything except the ground elevation. And so this is from one of our publications, the PGI field trip, Professional Geologists of Indiana field trip. And again, I can make any of these publications available to you if you like, but it's Beaches, Dunes, and Holes, a very original name. We got right to the point. So let's see if that works. What we have here in Northwest Indiana is parabolic dunes. So as the wind blows, because we have vegetation, it's going to anchor the arms of the dunes, and the prevailing winds or predominant winds are going to stretch it into a horseshoe or a parabola shape. So I love this little image. It was from the National Park Service website. And up here at the top, you can again kind of see, all right, we tend to have a nice ridge along the beach, but then the waves come in, crash it, and they form these parabolas. And then over time, again, like I told you, the sand is going to go up and the whole dune form is going to migrate, but not across the land. It's just, again, going up and down and over and burying anything in its path. And what's really special about this LiDAR that you can see distinctly too is we get these parabola shapes down here a little bit to the south. Great Marsh is here in the center. And so on the north side of Great Marsh, part of that oldest part of the Tolleston Beach, you can see that we've got eastward facing parabolic dunes and some nice nested ones here. And that shows us that the wind direction was coming from the west, maybe slightly from the northwest. And when we were doing some of our other publications, we did some OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating, and we found that all of these dunes stabilized about 3,500 years ago. And that makes sense. It agrees with the lake level curve where we saw the lake level drop, tons of sand being mobilized, and then the landscape stabilized and became forested with oak forest. Now up here nearest to the coast, we see that our younger, more active dunes, some of them are still active, some are pretty well vegetated, but they show that the wind direction somehow switched in between and that we are getting now more north winds. And so these are kind of south facing parabolic dunes. And you see how they stack on top of each other? That's key to the story of Mount Baldy. So what Mount Baldy is here is some of our eastward facing dunes. These are the 3,500-year ones. This is the entrance to Mount Baldy with the little circular parking lot. This is an older image because now that north side of the parking lot is buried. Okay, so just since 2013, this has been completely buried. And now you can see that kind of opening to the north, that parabolic shape of Mount Baldy. Mount Baldy's long been called a large parabolic dune. It is migrating up and over on top of that eastward facing dune. Okay, so it's a dune on top of a dune, which is something that I just don't think that we fully appreciated the implications of that until this accident. Now, the National Park Service has long known that it's been migrating. And so some of you may remember this, some of you may not at all, but we used to actually have fencing at the bottom of the slip face. And so this woman is standing in front of a sign that told everybody about the fact that the dune is a living dune, that it's actively migrating, burying trees, and the maps were of the base of the slip face, or oftentimes we saw the crest being mapped as it kind of moved. But where I became really passionate about this dune, and the reason I was out there on that day was because I realized that the three-dimensional shape of Mount Baldy was changing. LIDAR was just coming on the scene. So we actually had the potential to figure out how is this big geomorphic feature actually changing in three-dimensional space? Because I had people telling me kind of that they observed that the dune was getting shorter too. So that's why we were out there that day. We were trying to help with some of the restoration efforts and understand and map how this dune was changing in three-dimensional space. All right, so now you guys understand a little bit about dunes, and hopefully you're thinking, well, again, I understand there should be no holes in these dunes. So why did Mount Baldy start to migrate? Well, the story starts with humans, who I like to call the dominant force of environmental change. And what that means is that they can just change landscapes drastically in ridiculously short amounts of time. So we had, if we go back to that original map, one thing I didn't point out is that you see that on the side where Mount Baldy and where Hoosier Slide used to be and where Crescent Dune is today, that you can see the shoreline has already kind of stepped in a little bit. And what that's telling us is that even in this early map, you may look at it and think, oh, it looks like a cartoon, but it's actually quite accurate. We're starting to pile up or catch some of that sand that's trying to move east to west, that longshore drift that's trying to get down to the basin. And we're catching it on the east side of this harbor structure, and that triggers the erosion on the backside. And so that's the beautiful thing about nature. Whenever you have deposition, you need to be asking yourself, okay, if I'm depositing, what's the counterbalance to that? Where am I eroding? And so you can see up here, this is from one of the fact sheets that we've created for Lake Michigan, but it shows that as sediment is trying to move from the right to the left of our screen, or the east to the west, as it does along our coast, it's getting trapped by any of the hard harbor structures that are out there. We get these nice, beautiful beaches like Washington Park in Michigan City, but then on the backside, if you're Mount Baldy, you're subject to erosion. So this was a picture that was taken in the 80s, actually, by my friend Mark Reshkin. And so you can see here that this shoreline, this is just down from the harbor. NIPSCO would be just a little bit here to the left, so I apologize for some people who may not know the area. We have Crescent Dune, and then we also, you can see that this is completely rip-wrapped to protect it from erosion. But behind that rip-wrap, we've gotten these eddies and scouring, and here is Mount Baldy. So there's only two ways that the sand can go once we trigger erosion. And see how steep the edge of this is? That steepness is telling us that erosion is the dominant force. So this was taken after the high water levels in the 80s. And so there's two ways that the sand can go. It can continue along with its littoral drift, which again is east to west. So it's going to head on down towards Dune Acres. Or it's going to get blown up by the winds onto the landscape and onto the surrounding forest that you can see here. So Mount Baldy, again, is a dune on top of a dune. We had the 3,500-year-old dunes that were underneath, and then all of the sand is burying it on top. So this is again from the Geologic Resources Inventory. But I loved these pictures because what some people forget is that in 2011, the National Park Service actually saw so much damage to Mount Baldy that it was declared impaired. And that was a pretty drastic designation. And it required that the national park actually take action to protect and restore the resource. So you can see here, there's very little sand on this lakeward side. We have an eroding beach. We have the armored shoreline because of all that erosion. And there's little to no fore-dune, although we do have this nice little line of trees there. They weren't doing much work to protect the dune. Completely unvegetated surface. And it's migrating to the right or back towards Highway 12 and 20. And this little water tower in the back is kind of what started a lot of my addiction, because one of my colleagues, Charles Morris, actually said, man, when I was a kid, I couldn't even see that water tower when I stood on the beach. And I was like, man, we don't understand how this is changing in 3 dimensions. But here in the middle, you can see this snaking through. This is what we call a paleosol. So this is a buried soil. A soil only forms when a landscape has been stable. So once the landscape kind of stabilized about 3,500 years ago, it developed this nice soil and oak forest again, mostly black oak. But once we triggered erosion, we kicked sand up on top of that. So when we see a paleosol, we know that we basically have an older dune that is now has a cap on it with the paleosol, and then we have what we call the upper dune, which is probably a historical feature. So again, kind of a confusing idea for the national park. Like, how do you manage something that is this natural or is this man-made if the sand was only blown on top of it because we actually had the harbor that was built and blocked the littoral drift? And in doing some of our research and scouring, we found evidence from neighboring dunes. This one, I believe, was from Hoosier Slide, where they were mining the dunes so rapidly. These are train tracks going in to help mine away the sand. But already people were noting that we had paleosols. They were buried by sand that had blown on top, and you could see the exposed trees. Okay, so again, this is a phenomenon that has been happening, but they believe that it was triggered in the last 30 years. So about the 1920s, 1930s, we know there was a lot of sand that was moving, burying forests in the area. So with the landscape being declared impaired, the National Park Service took a lot of action. And that's actually where I got involved. I was starting to map, again, where we might be depositing sand, where we might be accumulating sand. We were working with them on wind blocks. So the idea was to drop a bunch of wind blocks to see, just like a snow fence, if you could break the energy of the wind, because the wind accelerates as it goes up the slope of the dune, and then get the sand to kind of fall out. So there were a variety of materials that the National Park Service was using. There was active restoration, really dedicated efforts to do seeding and even install the Meram plugs. And then there was designated access. So again, there were signs blocking off the base of the slip face, asking people not to go up there. But then there was also a roped off area that led people directly from the lake up to the crest. So they could still have that experience, but they would try to keep them in one contained trafficked area while they did the plantings. So that's kind of where we were when we hit July 13th, 2013. We were actually out there again with my students. We had just had our first full successful day of mapping wind speeds around the dune. And then this is what we saw. We saw the family that was up, way up on the dune. And this is another thing that made this very unusual. Everyone that I talked to after the accident, when I said, you know, there was a boy that became trapped in a hole, everyone just said, well, sure, they were digging near the beach. This was completely different. This is more than halfway up the slope. And clearly this was not a case of someone digging at the beach and then a sand collapse. So this is where the science had to come in as well. Plus in the headlines, they called it a sinkhole. A sinkhole has a very distinct meaning to geologists. And I know maybe that sounds like we're being nitpicky, but a sinkhole occurs in solid rock. This is definitely not a sinkhole. So if we wanted to get this right, we really had to figure out what was happening here. So we wanted to know, how do the holes form? Are there more? Where are they? How does the National Park Service protect the public from a new type of hazard? And what is their role actually under their mission? There were a lot of conversations about how if you go out to the Grand Canyon, there's just a sign, please do not step off the edge. So how do we decide what action the National Park Service should take? And then how does the National Park Service take that action and also continue on with the required restoration to help repair the impaired natural resource? So now we're getting to the heart of this, which I want to tell you about the progress of the science and what we've been doing for the last 10 years. Immediately after the accident, obviously everything was shut down. No one knew exactly what to do. But as I mentioned, I was somewhat obsessed. Again, that was mainly because this had rattled my experience and my knowledge of the dunes so deeply. Every scientist that I called afterwards just said, there's no way that could happen, Erin. And luckily, again, you really only need one good friend. That one good friend was Todd Thompson, who happened to be the state geologist. And he basically said, well, if she said it happened, and now we got to figure out why. So I was able to also go out immediately afterwards. It takes a long time to put a study in place in the national park. So there had to be a proposal and an outline and contracts. But the park did let me go ahead and start doing some preliminary kind of low impact observational work. So we started with some really high-tech tools, which are a trowel and a paintbrush. But immediately we had this idea again of the trees. It turns out that you probably were up there many times and you saw little traces of limbs from buried trees, but if you kick them, they would just disappear because the limbs were going at basically like an angle. So it would be hard to see them, and they were often very, very small. So I found every single trace that I could of these organics and was able to start digging and excavating. And here's one example of a limb that I had excavated. And inside the center, we could see that fungus or fungi were doing the hard work of decomposing the tree from the center outward. And so we created this initial study where we were able to come up with the conceptual model for what was happening on Mount Baldy. And my partners on this were Peter Avis, Mark Kreckler, and Charlie Morris. And so in this, we talked about the fungi. We cultured the fungi to find out that these are saprotrophic fungi that love dead wood. And so that became its own field of study, is kind of the succession of fungus that get into these trees. And how they might start on live wood, then there's another assemblage of fungi that come in that want to decompose the dead wood. And the other thing that still blows my mind is that if you were to touch this log, again, that's been buried, it just falls apart in your hand. So it feels like mulch that you would get at the garden store. But if you blow the sand off of this, it becomes more of a dry rot, a different type of fungi, and it becomes a very hard, stable structure. And so again, we've been seeing ghost forests, and we knew that there were ghost forests for probably over 100 years. And so no one really thought about the hazard of what about the part of the wood that is underneath the actual dune itself, which turns out to be more of this kind of a moist white rot that, again, if you put your hand into it, it just simply falls apart. After a big storm, we were able to finally go ahead and realize that this conceptual model was accurate. So we had a really strong October storm. We went up and we found this limb, and I was standing there looking at it, and I said, okay, if I thought that this was, if I were a tree, where would the trunk be? And I stepped backwards and I stepped into this hole, which turned out to be 8 feet deep. All right, so that was the first one that we had found that kind of mimicked what Nathan had experienced, a long vertical shaft that would be big enough for basically a small child. Most of them, but up to that time, had been really, really small. Another thing, if you can see behind me, the reason why this is perfect, and it's not that I'm happy, but I'm happy that we're finally figuring this out. Just over the top of my head there, you can see the paleosol. So what I know is that I've got the older dune underneath me on the Lakewood side, and that this hole that I have found is probably a tree rooted into the soil that's the surface of that underlying 3,500-year-old dune. So I am in what we call the upper younger dune. So with that information, we were able to publish with a conceptual model. This is my very poor attempt at drawing, but this is that same model of a dune at time 1 that then migrates time 2 and time 3. The gray here is the arm of one of those 3,500-year-old dunes, and imagine that it's coming straight at you out of the screen. And the tree was rooted onto that, but completely buried at time 1. And that was probably around the 1930s, 1950s, we find that that arm of the dune was still buried, or so, I'm sorry, was still exposed in the 1939 photo. So we know that those trees have been buried for about 70 years. And that's part of the key of this too, that oak trees decompose in about 70 years. Okay, so by the time we get on to time 2, maybe if you were up on Mount Baldy on the surface, you might have seen a few limbs, but you wouldn't have thought much of it at all, no big holes. But by time 3, the surface of that dune has actually migrated so much that it has descended through what would have been the canopy of the tree. And now what Nathan would have come upon is the actual top of the vertical trunk of that tree. And that's how we can get a vertical open conduit that he could slide into, because again, he was rescued more than 10 feet below the surface. Another really important key to this whole study was understanding the decomposition of oaks. Again, that was not in my background, but the resource management team was actually doing the oak savanna restoration. So they were cutting down a lot of oaks, or a lot of oaks had fallen as part of their restoration. So we started measuring the pattern in which the oaks decompose from the bottom up, and they also decompose from the center and outward. And so here you can see I found an oak tree, and just for the sake of pictures, I have stuffed myself inside there, but it gives you the idea of how, if you have that and it was buried, it's not going to fill with sand, because again, you still have plenty of wood above it to go ahead and keep the sand out. Again, in the dune, once it's buried, there's no change in the lateral forces. It's just buried. But what changes is how much support you have from the organic material within the tree from below, and then also how much weight of overlying sand you're going to have above you. The other thing that we wanted to demonstrate is here I'm standing at Mount Baldy next to one of these trees, and you can see that obviously I could fit. So a smaller 6-year-old child, it's totally reasonable that they could fall into a hole like this. And then also you can see that they start branching. We estimated somewhere around 15 feet. So you get the idea that yes, this type of tree can have a large and tall vertical shaft that could be created when decomposition occurs. So the key is that he happened to, again, timing was everything. He happened to come upon this hole right when the collapse had happened, or shortly thereafter, because we now know that, as soon as they start to dry out, they collapse. We can find them in the wintertime. So again, this accident was just a perfect storm of him probably seeing this open hole, but our team had been up there previous days, that whole day. We didn't see an open hole, and there's no reason to think that it would stay open very long. And unfortunately, that's exactly what he experienced. Once he was in the hole, it just collapsed and filled in almost like an hourglass. So the next step, the larger contract, was to go ahead and do the internal stratigraphy. So I'm just going to call it phase 2, but really there's an ongoing work with this. And the majority of that work is published in this publication from Journal of Great Lakes Research. So what we need to do is see inside the dune, and there's 2 tools that we use to do that. One is a ground penetrating radar, and we use 3 different frequencies because the different frequencies can penetrate to different depths and get us different resolution. And then we also used, in order to ground truth that, we had to take cores. So this is what we call a geoprobe. The team would go up there and extract the core, and then it was our job to describe it. Here's the map that shows you Mount Baldy. We had 3 long transects for GPR. And then we had a very high density grid that we did here of GPR. And then there was a hole, the hole was estimated to be in this area. And actually we were able to pick up some of the signature of where they had excavated in the ground penetrating radar. So there was a high density grid done over that. And then all of these individual numbers are where we took geoprobes. Let's look at the ground penetrating radar first. Again, we have, it's giving us an internal image. Remember those slip faces we said that form as the dune is migrating? You can see those nicely in this top image here. We have these, what do you see, these really nice surfaces here? That means we've picked up a change, okay? So a really nice reflector. And so we're afraid we wouldn't get much in uniform sand. So we must have been picking up the paleosol. And then there's a couple, again, a flat reflector down here. And so you can see kind of how we package this in the lower image. And so again, this is mostly the work of, well, really the work of Todd Thompson, who did this, this surface number 3. Then we have in between here, we have the lower dune, and the lake, of course, is to the right. So this is the lower older dune. This P2 is the Paleosol, which is on top of that 3,500-year-old dune, which remember, this would be an arm here where we have the P2s labeled. And then we have this upper younger dune, which would have been mobilized once the pier went in. So about 150 years of sand being blown up on top. And so this is showing us again the internal stratigraphy of Mount Baldy. I really like this drawing. Maybe I like the color, but we've also superimposed on here all the ages that we got, both from radiocarbon dating of any organic material that we thought was a reasonable proxy, and then also optically stimulated luminescence, which directly allows us to date the sand and the last time it saw light. And so what we have here is the clay in purple underneath Mount Baldy that we saw in the earlier stratigraphy. So this is part of that Nipissing transgression, or the lagoon that was trapped behind. But we have eroded so far into the landscape that now we've actually chomped into the older landscape. We've lost everything that was younger up front. Then we have the lower dune here in salmon. All the ages came back between 3,500 and 4,500 years ago. The Paleosol, and then on top, the sands that were blown up due to disturbance and human disturbance, dated to 100 years or less. And again, there's a plus or minus on that, but they're all historical. So I liked to add this idea of an oak tree. And you can see here, if we put the oak trees in, the ones that are again on top of the arm of the dune are going to be closer to the surface. So this was a really key thing that we had to change in people's thinking. We always say that Mount Baldy is 120 feet tall. And so people think it's 120 feet of just pure sand. And that is not it at all. This is sand that is blown up on top of a landscape. So the Park Service has been amazing at really starting to understand that what really matters here is sand thickness, okay? And that's going to be critical to the risk. So how thick is the sand above that Paleosol, and do you have trees? If you're back here near the crest, of course, you've got plenty of sand. Your tree is fully buried, little hazard, although I will note that that has changed, and we'll see that later. This surface is actually now vertically deflating, and we're starting to see these trees that have only been buried in the last 20, 30 years, whoops, are now emerging through the surface. So what Nathan came upon, you can see this is the approximate location of the hole. So you can see that this tree is rooted on top of the arm of the dune, and that he came upon the top of the vertical trunk. Again, kind of a perfect storm. But this concept of sand thickness is what moved us to the next level of creating geohazard maps. And so we were really, really lucky. We were able to find a 1970s topographic map that had 2-foot contours. Most of the time they're 10-foot contours. So 2-foot contours gives us much, much more detail. And so the cartographic team down at Indiana Geological and Water Survey digitized that map, and that became a base layer for us. And then when you fly the LiDAR, again, you're seeing the surface. So that's how, in addition to going out there and taking cores and getting ground penetrating radar, we can now create a digital 3-dimensional model of the thickness of the sand in Mount Baldy. And every time we fly the LiDAR, we can generate a new map of what we call an isopac map, which is really the thickness of the sand. And so we've color coded it. Anything less than 5 feet is not much of a hazard, right? It's pretty safe for most people. If the thickness is 5 to 20 feet, that's the range of the vertical trunk. And so potentially there could be a hazard. 21 to 30, again, is kind of in the warning zone. And anything from 30 to 40, again, is kind of safer. And 40, again, and thicker is, of course, going to be very safe. So what you see from these diagrams, on the bottom here, we have a 2013 LiDAR map, and you can see that the hazard or the danger zone stretches across the middle of Mount Baldy, where you have the arm of that kind of eastward facing dune, and the other arm is wrapping underneath here as well. But the sand is so thick, it's not much of a hazard. We also have then the 2018 LiDAR. In that one, you can see something really important here. Over time, the dune is flattening, because whereas a typical parabolic would keep its angle of repose and just kind of migrate along, this landscape, the sand is going to start blowing off. And we predicted that, and it's nice to see it kind of happening. But with the erosion is kind of stabilized at the shoreline, and we have that underlying paleosol, which sort of anchors the center of the dune. And so what we're now starting to see is that the crest is flattening, which makes some people sad because it's not as tall as it used to be, but it's now becoming more of a dune field than a parabolic dune. And this 2018 map kind of shows that down in the bottom left there. You see that new yellow patch, which means that the sand is blowing off and that we're again starting to get into more of a hazard zone where we are decreasing the thickness of our sand for the paleosol. The other thing that we can see with this map is the migration of the base of the slip face. And so the red and the yellow don't mean as much there, but it shows us the position of the slip face. And in 2013, we still had the bathroom. We still had this turnabout. By 2018, we were creeping up here on the edge of the turnabout, and we don't have the most modern LiDAR. They haven't flown it, or I'm sorry, they haven't released it and processed it, but you can drive out there today and you can see that Mount Baldy has now covered this turnabout. And so this road is actually closed on the north side and you can only drive in and out. Also, the restroom is still working, but there was a transformer that sat next to it, and that has had to be moved because of the inevitable burial of that system. So here are just a couple of things that we are now continuing to do. Of course, we can regenerate those hazard maps and understand it. Again, I will note just one thing, that even as it starts to flatten here at the crest, those trees have not been buried as long. So in my opinion, they probably don't have the same risk of decomposition the same way the other ones did, because they have not been buried for that 70 years. What is kind of scary is how they protrude now, and they're kind of like emerging out from the dune. As this crest flattens, you start to see them now re-emerging above the surface. And this gives us a nice image here of how much sand we actually lose. Todd and I chopped off the top of this tree to run the ground penetrating radar directly over the tree. I do want to say you cannot just run a ground penetrating radar over and pinpoint the trees, because what we found happens is that the signal just bounces off the first thing that it hits, and it's too much noise. And so we're not able to, it's not like you could just bounce it down and image where every tree is. So that's not a success. It hasn't been yet a successful approach to finding where there could be potential holes. But you can see how much tree we cut off in 2016. We came back in 2018 and we had a good 1.5 meters exposed. There's even more now. I need to go update that picture. And here's a nice diagram. You can see the great work of restoration that's happening. A lot of this is just from taking the pressure off of the dune from human activity, but you can see the grasses were really successful in that lower part of the dune, and that's also probably because it's more compact, very, very compact, as opposed to the upper fluffy part of the dune. And so there's more moisture, more minerals, and the sand has been, or sorry, the grass has been doing a really successful job of migrating up to about the middle. But now what's interesting is, instead of having a nice crest and then going back down the slip face, we have a huge hump in the middle here. And then it gets lower behind the center as we migrate off and over that buried arm. And so this upper part of the dune is starting to get grass in scattered spots, but it's still remains largely open for wind transport, although without the high elevations, we see that the wind speeds are a little bit less. And so we're hopeful that we'll start getting some vegetation up on that part as well. So to leave you, I'm going to show you just kind of 3 key papers that we have out there that you're more than welcome to get. I can even just send them to Save the Dunes if that's an easier way to get them to people. But we have a lot of reports. You guys made me pull all my work together, and so I realized how much we really have out there to share with you. This is a fun one. It's a field guide, so you can actually kind of follow the field guide yourself and visit 3 or 4 stops in the Indiana Dunes to learn more about their geology. And before I go, I do want to say thank you again to the interpretive team. I picked some of the pictures off the web, mainly because I could see that they would have like Bruce and Kelly and JP and people that I know have been, and Rafi, who have been really critical to sharing the science. And I also want to just say thank you to any Park Service people that are there, because we had a really unique opportunity where I got to team up with the Interp folks through a program called iSwoop, and we got to actually develop the interpretive hike for Mount Baldy based on the science that we have. So they keep spreading that science. And then as a final parting note, I want to urge everyone that one of the biggest lessons we learned is to stop social trails and stay on designated trails. This is an area near me, and while we think that the dunes just restore themselves, they change. So they change in response to human pressure. And here you can see where the crest of this dune is just incised. The sand is getting mobilized. We've fragmented the habitat. We're spreading invasive species. And so every footprint matters. And I'm just going to leave you with that encouragement to stay on designated trails, because even in a place where we may have hazards, the more trafficked the trail, probably the less likelihood of a threat. This is the part where I see if you're all still there. Hey, thanks, Mary.
Yay, Rashayla. Nancy, you are on mute.
I'm always on mute. So anyhow, Katie, if you'll do your usual, scanning of questions that are there and comments on Zoom, and also take a look to see if anybody on Facebook has dropped something in comments.
Absolutely. We do have a few in the comments already.
Yeah, we're going to do the questions first, comments if we have time.
Okay, great. So Valerie asked, would Hoosier Slide have had the same issues if it still existed?
No. So Hoosier Slide was on the east, make sure I get this right. No, Hoosier Slide would have. It probably would have had the same problems. Yes, because it was downdrift of the shore. Crescent would have also, so Mount Baldy was just not mined away. So yes, I expect we would have seen the same issues. And we are seeing burial in other locations too, now that we see, rapid foot traffic.
Okay, thank you for that. Someone asked where they'd be able to get the links for the documents you were sharing at the beginning, like the geological NPS report. Like, would you be able to drop that in the chat, or?
Yeah, sure. The NPS one for sure, and then the other ones, I should probably finish my professional webpage. Maybe after 30 years at the university, I'll do that. But you can always email me, and I'm happy to just send them to you as well. For those, but let me drop the one for the National Park Service in the chat right now. It's a really,
Erin,
really great one.
Yeah, Erin, you could also send those to Katie and to me, and Save the Dunes would probably be a depository for those. And then anybody that would like those links, my Gmail is nancyforvision@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to forward those to anybody that requests those.
I'm going to put my email in the chat as well, just if it's easier for people to grab it off of here.
I will repost that in the Facebook comments too. Can you tell us what software you're using to process the information from LiDAR?
Ooh, from LiDAR. Yeah, so LiDAR, I am using just ArcGIS Pro. Yes. And I will say that, I usually use the digital elevation model that actually has been produced already by the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. So the state produces it, and you can download that information, and then I can turn it into hill shades and manipulate it in ArcGIS Pro. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Do you have any opinions on how long it will take for the Mount Baldy to reach Highway 12?
I don't think it will. Ooh, I just said that, didn't I? I put that out there. I don't think it will. I think it will, given the way that it's changing right now with the big ridge in the center of it and the fact that it's deflating so fast. I don't think it will reach Highway 12. And that is just my prediction. We know that it's moving at an average rate of about 5 meters per year, but I think it is running out of fuel. And so that was one of the questions that we had is, if we keep nourishing at the beach and putting more sand in the front of the beach, and then it just blows up and over again. And I was just talking to a friend who works out at the Jersey Shore, and he said all they do is they just bulldoze it from the slip face and take it right back out to the beach. And it's a never ending maintenance thing that they have. It's not a national park, but he said that is very common in areas where there's a lot of foot traffic, is that there's just so much impact on the dune that they've just had to implement this constant management of bulldozing the sand and moving it back. That wouldn't be an option for a national park, because I think it would fly against their mission. But I'm excited. I think it will flatten, and I don't think it will reach the Highway 12. That's my prediction personally. And that has a lot to do with some of the other shoreline work that I'm looking at, as far as how far inland will it erode. And after that nice high that we just had, I'm hopeful, and that's one of my projects right now, is figuring out, like, maybe we've kind of stabilized how much inland erosion we're going to have in that zone. I know I put a lot out there. Check back with me in another 10 years to see how we did.
I'm excited to hear that. That's much better news than I was expecting. Was there anything else buried besides trees? Like, there weren't any, like, this was at a time frame when there wouldn't be any structures, correct?
So that was really, really hard. I'm not going to say that I can answer that definitively. One of the first ideas that we had, that it was a buried structure, that it was a chimney from something. It's been really hard to find records of which buildings were taken down and which ones are gone, but we're pretty confident that the buildings have been taken down. There might be a staircase still under there. There used to be a staircase that went up to the slip face. And that's been buried long ago, because this is the second parking lot too that we're burying for Mount Baldy. And so there's been many people that I love. Anybody who can give me more feedback on that. We try to scour through like historical photos, and I know that most people have family photos that can tell us kind of more about that. But to the best of our knowledge, the structures have been taken down in the face of Baldy, even though in the past a couple had been buried.
Awesome. So as the dune continues to flatten, do you expect the danger from the holes to end at some point? And are there any other areas in the Indiana dunes where there could be this issue?
Yeah, so will the danger end? That's a tough one to say. I mean, I think there could always still be holes in those hazard areas where the arms are. Like I said, the one arm that we're seeing where the trees are now coming back out, like, it's crazy, right? They were buried, then now they're re-emerging. Those have still only been buried for about 20 years. So I don't expect them to give us bad holes for a while yet. So we'll have to remap that. Where else could there be? It's hard to say. I think it's anywhere where the dunes are migrating over the woods. So, I mean, we see some of that at West Beach still, I think. Noel can maybe answer that better than I can. I'm getting awful worried about Porter Beach right now. There's a lot of pressure on just Porter Beach of burying trees, and just because of the running up and down. And so we're seeing but again, the key would be how long have they actually been buried, and what stage of decomposition were they in when they were buried? Because it's not like they were all healthy trees when they were buried either. So what is nice about Baldy is, just because of the pattern of underlying dunes and the fact that we can get the LIDAR and the ground penetrating radar, we can kind of establish those zones. I would think there could be still random hazards in different places.
Very interesting. Noel confirmed staircases were buried within a year of its construction. So
money well spent.
I think that is all the questions that I'm seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, I would ask the audience to add anything. If Noel wants to add anything about his experience out there, that would be great. We have a body of knowledge in the audience. Oh, and I ran over.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So something that's perplexed me, and I'd like your comment on. So Zoran Kilibarda did a retrospective study of the movement of Mount Baldy. And although he did show some variation in the rates of movement inland, the more recent period didn't really, didn't show any acceleration. And the reason this has perplexed me is because between 1983 and 2000, Mount Baldy was moving, but very slowly. And after 1990, between 1997 and 2000, Lake Michigan dropped a meter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was after that drop that I observed, I don't have data, but I observed that Mount Baldy, the slip face, suddenly started migrating faster. Is that possible?
I was thinking the same thing. In my observation, that was what I was thinking. And we went back to we only have those 2 LiDAR maps, right?
Yeah.
That's what we use. I know Zoran was doing, periodic measurements out there, but we still came up with about 5 meters between both of our measurements. But I feel the same way you do. I felt like that we hit this point where it really started to flatten, and that sped up. And I think that's something we maybe need to revisit, and I have to think a little bit deeper about how to get that data, because we just didn't have the data there. Because now you can just watch it. Like I had the photograph of the woman standing in front, then I had Bill Monahan standing there at the edge of where the sidewalk would have been, and then just a few years later, now we've buried the parking lot, the spots completely.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't have much data before that. Basically, we have like 1970 to 2013 is our period of measurement. And then we just have 2013 to 2018. So I agree with you. I think it was moving faster, but my analysis through GIS didn't support my hypothesis.
Katie, could you be sure to pick up the question from Doug Ross, since she's here from the press, please?
Absolutely. Doug had a clarifying question. Just wanted to understand correctly that the pace of Mount Baldy's southern progression is slowing as it flattens. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say that it is slowing as it flattens. I would say that what we're doing is we're blowing the body of sand that we have off the top. We're blowing it off. So when I said what's slowing is I think we're just running out of sand to move as far as reaching Highway 12. My data lines up with what Dr. Kilibarda had done ahead of me, which is about 5 meters per year. So we don't have evidence to say whether it really has sped up or whether it has slowed down, but it is very, very visible. I will say that, as Noel was just commenting, because you could see it bury the fence, then you could see it bury the sidewalk, then you could see it bury the parking spot, and then you could see it bury the turnabout. So it's much more visible. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Doug.
I want to acknowledge we're 15 minutes over our regular time right now.
I'd like to acknowledge that's good for me.
No, there are still questions remaining, but we're not going to have time to take care of those this evening. So Dr. Argyilan, I want to thank you so very much for being with us this evening and for sharing your area of expertise regarding the Dune decomposition chimneys, and also making some predictions as far as what the future looks like at Mount Baldy and also at Porter Beach. So the one thing we know, dunes are dynamic. They continually change. And thank you for your warning, and please people stay on the designated trails, because we're experiencing so much dune destruction because of people not doing that. Our next meeting will be the first Thursday in August, which is August 3rd, 6:30 p.m. Same place. We'll post the Zoom links ahead of time. And also you can always join us on Facebook Live by going to the Save the Dunes page. Katie, I believe you have an announcement about an upcoming event at Save the Dunes. So we'll wrap up and close with that, please. The open house.
Sure, yeah. At Save the Dunes, we are having, I'm sorry, my lighting is getting very dark in here. We're having an open house at the historic Barker House, which is Save the Dunes headquarters in Michigan City. So we are going to be doing a tour of the house and all the outbuildings, and just inviting people to enjoy our grounds and have some appetizers and enjoy good company. So that is going to be on our anniversary, which is June 21st. We're going to be sending out some information and invitations on that soon. So again, if you're not signed up for our email communications, please head to our website, savedunes.org, to get yourself signed up, because that is how we will be communicating that information. And it'll also be on our events page and Facebook page as well. But you're all invited. Hope to see you there.
And that is our 71st anniversary of the founding of our organization. So thank you all very much. Enjoy July. Get outside, stay on the trails, invite your friends and family members out to the dunes. I believe we have one of the most beautiful and unusual landscapes in the whole United States. And I can say that with confidence, having visited many of the national parks across the country. So enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye, everyone.